Hello and welcome to World 2017 Cgtn's year-end special. I'm Tian Wei in Beijing. From heightened tensions on the Korean Peninsula to more unrest in the Middle East, from the ups and downs of the U.S. politics to a new era in China, the year 2017 has witnessed the world making choices, countries fighting for security, and people pushing for a better environment. Over the next 75 minutes, we'll be looking back at some of the news which impacted us most and scenes that struck us most. We'll also bring a different perspective, getting opinions from you, our viewers worldwide. We carried out our polls on Facebook and Sina Weibo to find out your news picks of the year. We here at Cgtn also carefully curated a selection of notable news stories for the year 2017 and the top 5 striking videos of the year, consisting of compelling, unedited footage, raw and real. For now, joining us is my colleague Susan Roberts in Washington, D.C. and Panila Karib in Nairobi. Hi, Susan, and hi, Panila.
Hi, Tian Wei. Just ahead, we look at how U.S. President Donald Trump has changed his country's foreign policy.
And Panila?
Hi, Tian Wei. A little later, we will take a closer look at major political transitions in Africa and a very pressing environmental issue.
And let's start our year-end roundup with China's most important political event of the year, the Communist Party's 19th National Congress. It mapped out the country's path for the next 5 years and beyond. Our reporter Zhou Yun brings us the highlights and key decisions.
A fresh lineup for China's new leadership. Xi Jinping was elected as the General Secretary of the Communist Party of China's Central Committee for a second term.
Here, on behalf of the newly elected central leadership, I wish to express our heartfelt thanks to all other members of the party for the trust they have placed in us. We will work diligently to meet our duty, fulfill our mission, and be worthy of their trust.
And a new chapter for the country's future growth. In the report that he delivered to the CPC Congress, General Secretary Xi Jinping touched upon almost every aspect of China and laid out specific steps that concern the country's development on political, societal, and economic fronts. Xi Jinping said the coming 5 years is when the time frames of the 2 centenary goals will start to converge. This includes completing the building of a moderately prosperous society by 2020 and a modernized socialist country by mid-21st century. He also said that China is at a critical moment in its history as socialism with Chinese characteristics enters a new era.
This is our strategic vision for developing socialism with Chinese characteristics in the new era. Finish building a modernly prosperous society in all respects, proceed to achieving modernization, and then move to turn China into a great modern socialist country in every dimension.
Even though the new members of the current standing committee will bring their own visions, the country's crucial policies will continue and remain consistent. These include the government's measures to fight corruption, its commitment to improving the environment, its strong stance on opening up.
A new era with consistent policies and goals. The combination of the changed and unchanged values has helped the CPC to lead the Chinese people through the worst of times and now is guiding the country into a new era of hope and prosperity. Zhou Yun, Cgtn, Beijing.
From a fresh leadership lineup in China to the U.S., where President Donald Trump is wrapping up his first year in office. For some perspective on how they went, let's hear from my colleague Susan Roberts in Washington, D.C. Susan.
Tian Wei, during year one, President Trump touted the slogan, America First, all over the world. Some translate that to be a message against globalization, and in some regions, especially the Asia-Pacific, that idea has been met with heavy resistance. Here's Cgtn's White House correspondent Jessica Stone.
For a clear contrast among the world's major powers on the forces of globalization, look no further than this year's Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation meetings in Vietnam.
Globalization has brought important benefits to the development of the world economy.
But U.S. President Donald Trump used his first speech at APEC to underscore his opposition to it.
We are not going to let the United States be taken advantage of anymore. I am always going to put America first.
Even before he was president, Trump blamed free trade agreements for the loss of U.S. manufacturing jobs.
You know, we're sending our jobs to Mexico. China's taking our jobs, Japan. NAFTA's been such a disaster.
He wasn't alone. The Netherlands' Geert Wilders, France's Marine Le Pen, and Austria's Sebastian Kurz all gained influence in a populist anti-immigrant wave across Europe. In the end, only the 31-year-old Kurz won.
We've been talking about this for a long time. Thank you.
Almost immediately after his win, Trump withdrew from the Trans-Pacific Partnership Trade Pact. He also accused Beijing of dumping cheap steel in global markets and violating intellectual property rights. In 2017, Trump started renegotiating the decades-old North American Free Trade Agreement with Canada and Mexico, as well as the Korea-U.S. Free Trade Deal. Going into year 2 of the Trump presidency, NAFTA is still on the ropes, as is the Korea-U.S. Free Trade Agreement. But what we're really watching closely is the results of trade actions that Washington has threatened against Beijing. Jessica Stone, Cgtn, Washington.
And we want to get some analysis of what Mr. Trump's message means for the rest of the world. We are joined here in Washington by Afshin Malavi. He's a senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Institute, and that's part of the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Welcome to the broadcast.
Thank you for having me.
So Mr. Trump pulls out of the climate change agreements. How are these policies affecting his anti-globalization platform?
You know, in many ways, America First is starting to look a little bit like America Alone. I mean, and we're living in a world where 85% of the world lives outside of Northern America and Europe. We're living in a world where Asia Pacific is becoming the center of economic gravity. This is not the right time for America to be retrenching from the world. This is actually the time for America to be doubling down on globalization. So my view is that Donald Trump is taking the wrong turn at a seminal moment in global history.
What about his initiatives like the Trans-Pacific Partnership? He pledged to renegotiate NAFTA as well with Mexico and Canada. He's promised new bilateral trade agreements. Also, the U.S. economy, we want to point out, is growing. The stock market doing well. How do you explain all this?
You know, I think the U.S. stock market is growing because, you know, the tax cut that President Trump and the U.S. Congress has enacted, I think that's important. I think it's also important that you have a U.S. president that is deregulating business as well. And so I think that's contributing to the animal spirits of the U.S. economy as well. But I think what we're also entering is this strange era where we're seeing the post-American trade deals, so to speak. Mexico is revamping its deal with the European Union. Japan is doing a new deal with the European Union. And China is leading this new regional comprehensive economic partnership as kind of the, you know, the antidote to the TPP. And several TPP members have joined that trade deal.
Recently, Chinese President Xi Jinping offered a robust defense of globalization. Meantime, Donald Trump maintains the U.S. will not seek these multilateral trade deals. How do they navigate their relationship moving forward when one wants to do one thing and one wants to do the other?
You know, it's an important question because these are obviously the two most important economies in the world. So this is the most important bilateral relationship in the world. I think, you know, one of the things that President Donald Trump has shown is a surprising honesty on some issues where he has actually said to the media or said to others, you know, I looked at this Afghanistan issue or I looked at this X, Y, or Z issue and I realized it's actually more complex than I originally thought. And he said something similar regarding China and its relationship with North Korea. And so, you know, there's that old adage, where you stand depends on where you sit. Sitting in the Oval Office, I think he has come to appreciate the complexity of the China relationship. And I think it's one that he is navigating with a little, in a more measured way than we would have assumed from his campaign rhetoric.
All righty. Well, Afshin, we'll be speaking with you in a few moments again. Thank you so much. Yeah. We'll be right back. We'll come back in a few minutes for more analysis. For now, Tianwei, back to you in Beijing.
Thank you, Susan. Now in our Beijing studio, we are joined by Teng Jianqun, who is the director of the Department of American Studies at the China Institute of International Studies. Mr. Teng, welcome to our program. Happy New Year to you, I should say.
You too.
Well, at this point, China, from the very beginning of 2017 Davos until the end of the year in APEC, have been advocating globalization. United States talking about America first, when the two biggest economies of the world have very different ideas about how the world should be like. What does it mean for the rest of the world?
Actually, the two countries have already adopted very different approaches to the development of their own country. For example, China would like to share the achievements after at least 40 years reform and open up. But President Donald Trump would like to close the door. I think you cannot say it's a bad or good, a step taken by the two countries. We need a long time to give a clear-cut or comprehensive assessment of the policy adopted by the two leaders. And if you look at the history of the United States, sometimes the presidents of the United States would like to adopt a policy of isolation or protectionism. For example, the Washington time 200 years ago, 100 years ago, President Wilson also adopted some policy of isolation.
I see, but what about for now? Do we have solutions? China proposed Belt and Road Initiative. There's also shared community of a future from the Chinese side. How much will that contribute to the solutions of the problems that we all have these days in the world?
Because the two countries share different perspectives on the development of the world, I think China's proposal, we call it China Plan or China Act, actually is a very important part for the community to have a promising future. Actually, if you look at the history, we are facing several tendencies. For example, the multipolarization of international politics. No individual country can play a role in regional affairs or international affairs. And the globalization of world economy, the interdependence on each other. For the last year,
I see.
The total trade amount between China and the United States reached more than $520 billion. So I think this is a new era. We should have new vision toward each other, and we should have a new step to go ahead.
All right, and right now we are also joined in the DC studio, Afshin Molavi, Senior Fellow, earlier joined our colleague Susan in Washington, D.C. as well, from the Foreign Policy Institute at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. 2 points. DPRK issue and also trade likely to be controversial between China and the United States. Are we facing a tough year ahead?
We are certainly facing a tough year ahead. It doesn't look like it's going to get any easier on the DPRK issue. As we've seen, President Donald Trump, but not only President Donald Trump, his national security team has pinpointed the DPRK issue as really the crisis that they're going to be facing going into 2018. And we've also seen from Kim Jong-un, he can be erratic. He doesn't really care much for the fate of his own people. And so we could probably see more missiles being fired, and we're going to see that same dynamic play itself out. On trade, as I noted earlier, it seems that the world is moving on from the United States. Mexico's doing new trade deals with the European Union, and Japan is doing new trade deals with the European Union. There's the new Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. So, this is precisely the wrong time for Washington to be pursuing a America alone policy.
On the other hand, there is so-called the Indo-Pacific strategy that is being advocated by President Trump during APEC. Some say it is an extension of the rebalance. Others say it's really an empty concept. What exactly is it?
It's an important question because, this is really the first time we've seen this Indo-Pacific idea on such a high level. At the end of the day, I think everybody in Washington understands the importance of Asia-Pacific region. Look, by the year 2025, 2 out of 3 people are going to be living in Asia. The economic center of gravity has been shifting to Asia for the past 2 decades. When people in the Obama administration were talking about the Asia pivot, corporate America said, "Where have you been? We've been pivoting to Asia for the past 2 decades." So I think everybody understands that. By adding Indo to this idea of Indo-Pacific, I think the attempt is to include India in this. And I think the India relationship is going to be one that is going to grow in strategic importance to the United States going forward. The last point to note here is that the China relationship is well understood as being one of the most important, one of the most complex, and one of the most dynamic. And I think even President Trump is coming to understand that.
Right, but eventually, Mr. Tang, while you are listening to your American colleague, what exactly going to be the nature of this relationship? A friend or foe, competitor, or actually cooperation partners? Something has to be done about the concept of this nature.
Generally speaking, I think the relations between China and the United States have been intensified in recent years. I think there are two points that I'd like to mention here. The first is the balance of power between the two countries has been or is being changed. And under such circumstances, the competition and cooperation, especially in security and the economy, I mean economic trade, also have been intensified. For example, the competition in the South China Sea between China and the United States, and also the cooperation in trade. We can find some new areas if you look at the recent deal reached between China and the United States during President Donald Trump's visit early last month. I think you can find there is a fundamental change or shift from the consumer goods, shoes and the t-shirts, but now you have production goods. So this is a large areas. Some areas still not touched upon by the two countries. So we should have a strategic vision toward each other. We should have new areas to cooperate. Actually, the recent deal between China and the United States is only a beginning for the future cooperation between the two countries.
All right, Mr. Mola, we agree?
I do agree. I mean, and when you think about it, again, we have to get beyond the headlines and some of the tweets of President Trump. And last year, China had record-shattering investments in the United States, $46 billion worth of investments in the United States. There are entire companies like Apple, which generate 25% of their revenues from China. There's companies in Kentucky like Yum Foods that generate almost 50% of their revenues from China. Everyone is chasing, as China moves towards a more consumption-driven economy, major American multinational companies are chasing the Chinese middle class. So it's certainly a complex relationship, and the temper of the political relationship is not always mirrored in the temper of the business relationship, which is understood by all sides to be vital and growing, not retrenching.
Thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us. A lot to learn. Afshin Molawi in Washington, D.C., and Teng Junqin here in Beijing. Thank you. I really appreciate it. A year of tough decisions and consequential elections definitely shook up the political landscape in Europe. But what is the situation in Africa? Pernilla.
Thanks, Tianwei. 2017 was another pivotal year for Africa, with at least 13 presidential and legislative elections held. 5 stood out, in particular Zimbabwe, where the military asserted its authority on the political scene with major consequences. Cgtn'S Robert Nagila has more.
There were 5 key elections in Africa in 2017. In Rwanda, incumbent Paul Kagame won a third 7-year term. President Eduardo dos Santos of Angola stepped down after 38 years. He was succeeded by the former defense minister, João Lourenço. But the big story in August was a high-stakes election in Kenya, pitting incumbent President Uhuru Kenyatta against opposition leader Raila Odinga. The election was nullified by the Supreme Court, citing irregularities and illegalities in the process, plunging the country into a political crisis. Scores of opposition supporters lost their lives in clashes with security forces as the opposition pushed for electoral reforms.
This took us into a very uncharted territory because, thereafter, after the nullification, the Right Honorable former Prime Minister Raila Odinga withdrew from the race. There are those who argue that at the time when Raila Odinga withdrew, then that we should have cancelled the election and started the process all over again.
I, Uhuru Kenyatta.
With no direct threat to his candidacy, President Uhuru Kenyatta easily won the repeat poll in November. But it is Zimbabwe that grabbed all the political headlines. A succession battle between Grace Mugabe and Vice President Emmerson Mnangagwa to succeed President Robert Mugabe led to the sacking of the vice president. Less than a week after that statement, the military took over key installations and placed Robert Mugabe, who had been in power since 1980, under house arrest.
This is no longer a ZANU-PF matter. This is a national crisis. Why do I say so? Because we are talking of the interests of those with the security machinery and the infrastructure of the country being involved in politics.
Zimbabweans took to the streets, calling for Mugabe to step down. Within days, he was gone. Emmerson Mnangagwa was sworn in as president, promising to act on corruption and economic turmoil. Another key election was here in Liberia. It was significant because this would be the first peaceful transfer of power in the last 70 years. It would also be the first election conducted by Liberia. The last two elections were conducted by the United Nations. Robert Nagila, Cgtn, Monrovia, Liberia.
Let's get you some perspective on that. Gideon Chitanga joins me live in studio. He is a PhD fellow and a researcher at the Center for the Study of Democracy. Mr. Chitanga, thank you for joining us. It's been a very eventful year for many African countries that have experienced political transition. What are some of the key lessons learned?
From the narrative that has just been given, you can see that political transitions in Africa are problematic. And we use the term political transitions to imply that these countries are moving from a certain state of politics which is authoritarian to a more democratic dispensation. I think that some countries have made interesting progress. And recently it was Liberia, it was the Gambia. A few months back, Angola has had a fairly smooth transition, although it was a transition from the same party but changing in terms of its leadership. If you look at Kenya and if you look at Zimbabwe, you actually see that there are serious problems with the political systems. And in my perspective, I take it that the political system which excludes other interested parties always creates this vicious struggle which sort of seeks to eliminate the other parties and retain the others. And because of that, it is then difficult to have a system that allows the concerned parties to dialogue on the basis of the national interest. So countries like Kenya and Zimbabwe, in my view, they should seek a process of political accommodation. And I think external players should support a process where the domestic players in Kenya and in Zimbabwe seek each other and dialogue over their national interests so that they can only bring other outsiders to support the domestic interest and then enhance such normative aspects as rule of law and protection of property rights and so on in the process of creating political stability and securing the lives of ordinary people. The other dimension are leaders who simply accept constitutions and then change them to suit their interest to stay in power. This is also problematic, but fundamentally all these countries, those that have had smooth transitions and those that are struggling with political transitions, should invest more effort in developing their institutions and accepting political behavior that is moderated within the purview and framework of their institutions so that they make progress.
All right, so let's leave it there for now. Gideon Chitanga live for us in Johannesburg. Thank you. Well, Tianwei, more and more Africans are getting involved in the governance and leadership of their countries, and engaged citizenry, it is hoped, will translate to more stable democracies. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Panina. So that is for Africa, but what about for Europe 2017? For more, we are joined by our correspondent Richard Bestick in London. Richard, you covered together with all of us about the Catalonia independence vote. How is that event likely to impact politics elsewhere in Europe?
Well, you're right, Tianwei. I was down there for a couple of weeks, and while on the face of it, Catalonia's cry for independence appears to be part of the same winds of change sweeping Europe that feed into the rise of political populism here. There are big differences. The Catalonians have upheld their separateness from the rest of Spain for centuries. The puzzle is that they thought they could defy the Spanish constitution and declare unilateral independence. Now we have former members of the Catalan government languishing in a Spanish jail and others in voluntary exile for fear they'll go the same way. And the elections just a couple of days ago, which returned a majority of independence parties to the regional parliament, have settled nothing. In short, Spanish Prime Minister Mariano Rajoy's attempt to strong-arm Catalonia has resulted in nothing more than a simmering and bitter stalemate. There'll be no assistance from the European Union for the Catalans. The EU doesn't wish to see any fragmentation of the Union. Combined, it doesn't bode well for a politically happy new year. Tianwei.
Yes, well, the another thing is the rise of the right wing in politics in many countries in Europe. What is likely to happen next? Many wonder.
Well, it's still on the rise. There's no sign of it abating. The rise in political populism is an extraordinary phenomenon here in Europe. A report by Tony Blair's think tank claims populism is so widespread and deep-seated, Tianwei, it threatens to destabilize European democracy. The survey by the former UK Prime Minister's Institute for Global Change found the share of the vote taken by populist parties has almost trebled since the year 2000. And over the same period, it said the number of European countries with populist parties actually in government had doubled from 7 to 14. It's worth making the point that the Institute says that rise is from both the left and the right. It says the drivers for populism are economic insecurity, immigration, and the ease with which extremism can make itself heard in the age of social media. Is it a bad thing, Tianwei? Well, to paraphrase China's former paramount leader, the late Deng Xiaoping, when asked in Paris whether he thought the French Revolution was a good idea, it's probably too soon to say. It does, however, appear to suggest we'll be having an unpredictable political new year here in Europe.
Well, as they say, only time could tell, isn't it, Richard? Richard Brastick in London, thank you so much, sir, for being with us. Millions of European voters went to the polls in the year 2017 amid a rising tide of populist